In the heart of Nazi Germany, the air inside the Bromberg Dynamite Noble AG factory was always thick with the smell of gunpowder and metal shavings. The ceilings were high, lined with steel beams, and the walls seemed to absorb every sound, amplifying the relentless mechanical hum into a constant, oppressive roar. It was a place where human life was measured not by individuality, but by efficiency, the number of components a worker could assemble, the speed of their hands, the obedience of their labor. From dawn to dusk, the factory operated like a living organism, each piston, press, and conveyor belt functioning as a single, unyielding heart of the Reich's war machine. Erich Miller was one of its many cogs, a machinist by trade, a reluctant soldier of circumstance. Born in Hamburg, he had been conscripted from his modest upbringing into a workforce that was simultaneously revered and feared by the Nazi hierarchy. He was neither a member of the party nor a supporter of the regime. Erich had witnessed the destruction the Nazis had inflicted on cities like Dresden, seen families torn apart, and felt the cold indifference of authority when ordinary citizens were crushed beneath the weight of ideology. In the factory, survival was contingent upon compliance, and compliance meant doing what was demanded without question, no matter how morally corrosive. Yet beneath his gray work jacket, behind eyes that appeared fatigued and obedient, Erich harbored a spark of quiet defiance. It began with small things, misaligning a rivet ever so slightly, greasing a part that should have remained raw, allowing a tiny imperfection to pass inspection. To the untrained eye, these acts were invisible, harmless even. But the consequences were profound. Explosive shells that should have detonated with precision would misfire. Ammunition would jam at critical moments. The Reich's engines of destruction, so reliant on uniform perfection, began to falter in imperceptible ways. The factory itself was a microcosm of the war. Tens of thousands of workers moved in choreographed rhythm along the assembly lines, their faces blank, their speech measured, their loyalties tested at every step. Forced laborers from Poland, the Soviet Union, and other occupied territories were interspersed among German workers, all under the constant surveillance of overseers and Gestapo informants. Harsh punishments for even minor infractions were routine, beatings, imprisonment, or worse. And yet it was in this environment of fear and oppression that acts of courage began to emerge, subtle and unrecorded, invisible to the official histories of the Reich. Erich's methods of sabotage were meticulous. He would study a component for days, memorizing every measurement and tolerances, then, at the quietest moments, make microscopic adjustments that no supervisor could detect. Sometimes it was a delicate misalignment in a detonator casing. Sometimes it was the introduction of a material impurity that would only reveal its flaw when subjected to real combat stress. Each act required patience, nerve, and a profound understanding of both the machinery and the men who relied on it. He had become a silent scholar of destruction, turning his knowledge into a weapon not of bullets, but of subtle failure. The camaraderie of the hidden network he was part of became both a source of courage and a necessity for survival. They communicated in glances, in subtle gestures, and in codes buried within routine factory operations. One worker might pass a misaligned gear across the floor as if it were a routine handoff. Another would signal a critical flaw with a pattern of knocks on the metal frame of a press. Together, they orchestrated an invisible rebellion that was undetectable yet devastatingly effective. One evening, as the dim lights of the factory flickered, Erich hunched over a detonator casing. His hands, skilled and steady despite the tension, filed down the edges to create the slightest defect. Inside the metal, he etched a short message, a tiny declaration of resistance hidden in plain sight, down with the oppressors. It was invisible to anyone not intimately familiar with the part, but to Erich, it symbolized a moment of reclamation, a tiny seed of defiance in the mechanical heart of tyranny.
Outside, the world was crumbling. Cities were being bombed into rubble, families displaced, and soldiers pushed to the brink on both fronts. Inside the factory, however, time seemed suspended. The clatter of machines became a rhythm, almost hypnotic. Each hiss of steam, each metallic clang was a heartbeat against the oppression that loomed over the Reich. And within this suspended reality, Erich and his fellow saboteurs carved a space for human conscience, a place where ordinary workers could, in secret, fight back. Every day brought new challenges. Inspectors rotated unpredictably, quotas increased without warning, and rumors of executions for sabotage kept morale tethered to fear. Yet Eric's resolve hardened. He had seen firsthand the consequences of unchecked power, the devastation wrought by obedience without conscience. Every subtle act of disruption, every imperfection introduced into the machinery, became a statement that the human spirit could not be entirely crushed. By the winter of 1944, Eric's network had expanded to include dozens of workers, each playing a precise role. They were a hidden army within the Reich, fighting a war invisible to generals and historians alike. Every component that failed, every misfire that delayed a shipment, every minor disaster in the factories of the Third Reich was, in part, a testament to their courage. The machinery of oppression had become a stage for quiet heroism. And so, in the dimly lit corners of the Bromberg Dynamit Noble AG factory, amidst the acrid smell of explosives and the rhythmic clatter of metal, the war was being fought not just on distant battlefields, but in the hearts and hands of those who refused to obey without question. In this world of shadows and precision, Erich Müller became a phantom of resistance, a single man whose courage turned ordinary labor into an extraordinary act of defiance. Winter in 1944 had a way of magnifying every sound, every shadow, every heartbeat. The Bromberg Dynamit Noble AG factory, already oppressive in its vast metallic expanse, now seemed colder, harsher. The steel beams groaned under the weight of snow on the roof, and the low hum of machines felt louder, sharper, more accusing. Outside, the streets were empty, littered with scraps of propaganda leaflets and the occasional frozen bundle of a stray dog. Air raids had become routine, sirens wailing like banshees over towns that had seen too much suffering already. Inside, the factory worked tirelessly, almost oblivious to the crumbling world beyond its walls. Erich Müller moved through this mechanical forest like a ghost, hands steady, eyes calculating. Each day, the act of sabotage had to evolve, for the Reich's inspectors had grown sharper, their scrutiny more rigorous. A misaligned detonator might have gone unnoticed in summer. By winter, errors were caught, and suspicion had begun to circulate. Erich knew that the cost of discovery was death, swift and final. Yet he also knew that every misfire in the field meant another soldier spared, another civilian unharmed. This knowledge was both a burden and a fuel. He had begun keeping meticulous mental maps of the factory's workflow, memorizing which inspectors favored which machines, which guards' eyes lingered longest, and which conveyor belts offered the least surveillance. The sabotage had to be invisible, seamless. One misplaced rivet could save lives, but one mistake could destroy him. He had transformed from machinist to tactician, navigating both the machinery and the human elements of fear, greed, and obedience. To coordinate with his growing network of saboteurs, Erich devised a system of silent signals and codes embedded in the language of the factory itself. A subtle scratch on the casing of a shell indicated a critical flaw introduced. A shift in the placement of a tool could signal that a batch needed particular attention. Even the rhythm of hammering or the pitch of pneumatic hisses could carry meaning. It was an orchestra of subversion, every worker playing a note in a symphony of resistance. On particularly tense days, Erich would watch new inspectors, young men fresh from the Hitler Youth, their faces taut with pride and fear. They believed in the infallibility of the Reich, in the moral righteousness of their orders. They did not yet understand that power was fragile, that even a single human hand, subtle and deliberate, could undermine an empire. Erich studied them, memorized their routines, waited for the precise moment to act.
One day, as the winter sun barely penetrated the factory windows,
Erich prepared a batch of shells destined for the Eastern Front. These shells were crucial to an offensive planned against Soviet forces, precise, deadly, and expected to perform flawlessly. He handled them with care, fingers steady despite the adrenaline that always accompanied these moments. Using his intimate knowledge of metallurgy and timing, he introduced minute imperfections that would not manifest immediately but would render the shells unreliable once deployed. A young Polish laborer, Ivan, worked beside him, unaware of the full scope of Erich's plan but sensing the quiet defiance in his movements. Ivan had been brought to Germany by force, a boy of 16 torn from his family, his hands already scarred from forced labor. Erich had taken him under his wing, teaching him the subtleties of the machines and the language of sabotage. Together, they were part of a silent army, a hidden resistance within walls designed to crush spirit. The risk was omnipresent. Overseers roamed the floor with predatory eyes, and the Gestapo had a permanent presence, inspecting records, questioning workers, searching for patterns of inefficiency that might betray sabotage. Erich had learned to move like the machines themselves, mechanical yet fluid, predictable yet impossible to fully trace. Every day he performed an intricate dance with death, one that demanded absolute focus and nerve. As winter deepened, the results of his subtle sabotage began to emerge. Reports arrived in the evenings, carried by whispers and secret notes. Shipments delayed, detonators misfiring, and ammunition failing at critical junctures. The impact was growing, and with it came a mixture of fear and exhilaration. He was saving lives, altering the course of battles, yet each small victory was shadowed by the knowledge that discovery would be immediate and lethal. Erich's role expanded beyond simple sabotage. He became a coordinator, a mentor, a strategist. He studied enemy operations, reading news reports and military communications when he could, learning which shipments were critical, which offensives could be disrupted. Each act was calculated, precise, designed to maximize disruption while minimizing suspicion. It was not enough to simply damage machinery. He had to orchestrate failure that appeared accidental, unavoidable, inevitable. One evening, as snow fell outside in heavy silent sheets, Erich lingered in the corner of the workshop, examining a detonator casing under a dim lamp. He traced a finger along a minute imperfection he had introduced, imagining the battlefield where it would fail, imagining soldiers spared because of a small act of human defiance. Beside him, Ivan worked quietly, unaware that their tiny acts of sabotage were rippling outward, affecting the machinery of war itself. And as he worked, Erich reflected on the paradox of his existence. A man imprisoned by circumstance, operating under constant threat of death, yet wielding an invisible power that could, in the quietest of ways, change the world. Each screw, each adjustment, each whispered code was a rebellion, a statement that humanity could not be entirely extinguished, even within the heart of tyranny. In the shadows of Bromberg Dynamite Noble AG, the factory was being waged not only with bombs and bullets, but with intelligence, courage, and subtle defiance. Erich Mueller had become more than a machinist. He had become a phantom insurgent, a hidden architect of resistance, moving through the gears and pistons of the Reich's war machine with a skill born of fear, necessity, and unbreakable resolve. The snow continued to fall outside, silent and indifferent, while inside, the machines hummed, the metal hissed, and the invisible war of Erich Mueller escalated. By early 1945, the air in Bromberg had thickened with tension. The Reich, sensing the faltering of its war effort on multiple fronts, had intensified inspections, audits, and surveillance in every armament factory. Bromberg Dynamite Noble AG, already a crucible of fear, now felt like a cage with walls that were slowly closing in. Every whistle, every clatter of metal, every echo in the cavernous halls carried a weight of suspicion. Guards and overseers prowled with sharper eyes, interrogations became routine, and the Gestapo began issuing lists of unreliable workers.
Erich Mueller moved through this tightening noose like a shadow. The stakes had become personal. Each day he entered the factory, he was not merely a worker. He was a man threading a needle through the eye of history, balancing life and death with the precision that had now become instinct. He had trained himself to read body language, memorize patrol routines, and predict the attention spans of inspectors. He knew which supervisor had a temper that could explode at the slightest error, which engineer was secretly sympathetic but too terrified to act. The factory floor, once a rhythm of clanging metal and methodical labor, now resembled a minefield. Every machine was a potential trap. Every misplaced screw or delayed bolt could trigger suspicion. Yet Eric's network had grown. Ivan, now older and sharper, coordinated small acts of delay or minor sabotage with other laborers, each unaware of the full scale of the plan but attuned to the subtle codes. Tools were swapped, blueprints annotated with invisible ink, and minor misalignments introduced that would manifest only under battlefield conditions. Eric had learned the art of patience. He did not rush the sabotage. The most effective acts were invisible, delayed, and seemingly accidental. He studied the supply chains, the transport schedules, and even the personalities of the Wehrmacht officers awaiting shipments. A single imperfection in a detonator might cause a shell to fail in Siberia rather than at the factory. A misaligned fuse could save an entire platoon, far from the Reich's prying eyes. Every decision, every act of subversion had consequences that rippled outward like stone thrown into a frozen lake. But danger was mounting. Rumors of sabotage had begun to circulate, whispered behind closed doors. One inspector, unusually meticulous, had caught a flaw that Eric had intended to go unnoticed. Eric's pulse had raced, his mind calculating the risk. How could a flaw appear natural? How could failure be disguised as an accident? That night, in the dim light of a small workshop corner, he carefully adjusted every variable in the production line, ensuring that the flaw appeared as human error rather than deliberate sabotage. The Gestapo presence was a constant shadow. They had begun questioning workers aggressively, interrogating those who appeared too competent or too quiet. Eric had learned to mask his fear behind a calm, mechanical demeanor, moving with precision, offering no hint of the chaos beneath. The factory, to outsiders, was functioning flawlessly. Inside, it was a delicate web of controlled failures, invisible sabotage, and silent defiance. Eric's moral compass weighed heavily on him. Each act of sabotage was a decision between life and death, a negotiation with fate itself. He watched young soldiers, barely older than Ivan, march off to fronts where their survival depended on the hidden flaws he had introduced. He imagined them frozen in snow, their weapons failing, their lives spared in the most improbable of ways. And each time, he felt the paradoxical blend of relief and sorrow. Relief that his actions were saving lives, sorrow that he could never fully explain, could never take credit. Outside the factory, the war raged on. Cities burned, railways were bombed, and the Reich's authority crumbled piece by piece. Inside, Eric's sabotage was a quiet rebellion, invisible but increasingly effective. Shipments delayed, ammunition misfired, and explosives failed when they were needed most. Orders that had once been reliable were now laced with uncertainty. His work was an echo in the gears of an empire, subtle but profoundly consequential. One night, after the factory had emptied and the snow had thickened to a silent blanket outside, Eric and Ivan met in the shadowed corner of the workshop. They reviewed the day's work: mislabeled crates, slightly bent detonators, misaligned fuses. Ivan looked at Eric, eyes wide with both admiration and fear. He asked, "How do you know it will work?" Eric's hands rested on a cold steel table. He said, "We don't. We do what we can, and the rest is fate. The world is already broken. Our job is to make sure it doesn't get worse."
As the final weeks of the Reich unfolded, the pressure inside Bromberg became unbearable. Inspectors scrutinized every movement, and the Gestapo's shadows grew longer, colder. Yet Eric, now a master of deception, continued to orchestrate his invisible resistance, moving through machines and men alike with a precision that bordered on artistry. Every day, he played the dangerous game of subversion. Each small act of sabotage a calculated risk, with consequences that reached far beyond the factory walls. And as the Reich teetered, as its armies faltered and its cities burned, The quiet defiance of one factory worker had begun to ripple outward, subtly shaping the final days of a collapsing empire. By March 1945, Bromberg was a city on the edge of ruin. The distant thunder of artillery had grown insistent, the horizon often alight with fire that painted the clouds crimson. Refugees wandered the streets, their faces hollow, their eyes reflecting a terror that had become permanent. Rumors of advancing Soviet units intermingled with whispers of retreats, betrayals, and reprisals. The Reich's control over its own territory was thinning like frost under a morning sun. Yet within the reinforced walls of Bromberg Dynamite Nobel AG, life moved with a tense, mechanical rhythm, dictated by the factory schedule and the ever-watchful eyes of the overseers. Erich Merler had become a ghost within this machine. No one knew the full extent of his actions. Not Ivan, not the sympathetic foreman, not even the few trusted colleagues who assisted him. Every misaligned detonator, every sabotaged fuse, every mislabeled crate carried his signature in invisible ink. To the outside observer, these were minor errors, understandable mistakes in a factory strained under the pressures of a collapsing war. To Erich, they were calculated acts of defiance, carefully weighed against the lives they might save and the chaos they could cause. The Gestapo presence had reached a peak fever. Agents patrolled the factory with a predatory vigilance, interrogating workers at random, demanding lists of reliable men and women, checking work against impossible standards. One wrong word, one nervous glance, could be interpreted as complicity in sabotage. Erich had learned to control his breathing, his posture, even the micro-expressions that might betray his thoughts. He had become a master of invisibility, moving through the factory like a shadow, unseen yet omnipresent. And yet even ghosts can be cornered. One morning, an inspector with a reputation for ruthlessness arrived unexpectedly. He scrutinized the assembly line, noted every hesitation, and questioned workers in a tone that made the air itself tremble. Erich felt the familiar pulse of fear, but he had trained for this. Every action, every gesture had a purpose. He adjusted a conveyor, nudged a faulty component into a path that would appear accidental, and walked past the inspector with a calm so complete that it could have been mistaken for ignorance. The inspector left with a nod, unaware that the entire production line had just executed a subtle, deliberate miscalculation orchestrated by one man's mind. Outside, the world was collapsing faster than anyone could comprehend. Railway lines were torn by bombing raids. Cities that had once seemed permanent were now smoking ruins. Soldiers abandoned positions, leaving behind equipment and ordnance that had been designed to destroy, now sitting uselessly. Erich knew the clock was ticking. Every day, every hour, was an opportunity to introduce errors that could save lives or slow the Reich's machinery of death. But it was also a day closer to discovery, closer to the ultimate danger. Erich and Ivan met in their usual corner of the factory one evening. Snow had begun to fall outside, a thick, muffling blanket that made the world seem simultaneously peaceful and suspended. Ivan's hand shook slightly as he laid out the day's alterations. Slightly bent detonators, mismatched fuses, mislabeled shipping crates. "Do you think it's enough?" Ivan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Erich examined the list, his eyes tracing each item as though reading the future itself. "It's never enough," he said. "Not until the war ends. We don't save everyone, but we slow them down. That's all we can do."
In those quiet moments, Erich felt the full weight of his actions. Every misfire in the field, every delayed shipment, every failed explosive was both a triumph and a curse. He was saving lives, yes, but the cost was unseen, intangible, and morally complex. He had become both savior and saboteur, a man playing God within the steel heart of an empire's war machine. Then came the day of the final inspection. The Reich, desperate for results, demanded that every machine, every component, be tested under supervision. It was the most dangerous moment yet. Erich knew that if any flaw was traced back to him, even by accident, his life would be forfeit. The inspector,
A man whose eyes seemed to pierce through steel and wood alike paced the factory floor, clipboard in hand, observing every movement, every adjustment. Eric moved calmly, almost lethargically, adjusting a fuse here, nudging a detonator there, making the flaws appear natural, inevitable, human. As the inspection drew to a close, the inspector paused before a crate of completed ordnance. He tested a sample, one that Eric had subtly sabotaged. The fuse failed. A second test, a third. Each failed, but in ways that could plausibly be blamed on overwork, material fatigue, or minor errors by other workers. The inspector frowned, but found no evidence of deliberate action. He moved on, leaving Eric with a faint smile of relief and the thudding awareness of how close he had come to discovery. That night, after the factory emptied, Eric stood at a high window looking out over the city. Fires burned in the distance, and the once innocent snow was streaked with ash. The war was nearing the end. The Reich was collapsing. He thought of the thousands of lives his quiet acts had touched. Soldiers saved from catastrophic misfires, entire units delayed from advancing too quickly, children and families shielded indirectly by failures that no one would ever know he had orchestrated. And yet the weight of secrecy was immense. He could never tell anyone, never claim credit. He was a ghost in the machinery of history, a hidden hand that had subtly reshaped events. Eric Mueller, factory worker, saboteur, and reluctant hero, had operated in silence, bending reality without leaving a footprint. The city's final days would come soon, and with them the chaos, the surrender, and the liberation that would mark the end of one empire and the beginning of a world struggling to rebuild. Eric's actions, invisible to the headlines and unnoticed by the world, had nonetheless left their mark, an echo in the machinery of war, a testament to the power of quiet courage. April 1945 arrived like a storm long foretold. Bromberg's streets, once orderly and predictable, had become rivers of panic and rumor. Soldiers deserted in droves, trucks abandoned on cracked cobblestones, artillery left to rust in the open. The Reich, fraying at the edges, could no longer enforce discipline, and the factories, once humming temples of industry, were islands of tension and fear. Eric Mueller worked through it all, his hands steady, his mind calculating. Each sabotaged fuse, each misaligned detonator, each shipment that failed without explanation had done its work. Entire units were delayed. Trains carrying munitions derailed, not by chance, but by invisible hands. And yet he moved silently, unremarked upon, a shadow among shadows. Even as the city convulsed under the weight of impending defeat, Eric remained focused, calm, a conductor orchestrating a symphony of subtle defiance.
The day the Red Army entered Bromberg, the factory's gates were already empty, the machines still echoing faintly with the ghost of their labor. Guards had fled. Supervisors vanished, and the city itself seemed to hold its breath. Eric walked the streets, observing the advance quietly. Smoke rose from collapsed buildings. The sounds of distant gunfire and shouted commands blended into a surreal rhythm. He had survived, not by luck, though luck had played its part, but by foresight, calculation, and patience. When the Allies arrived days later, they found a city battered but not entirely broken. Factories lay in ruins, yet many of the bombs that might have detonated, destroyed infrastructure, or killed thousands had failed. Hitting sabotage, invisible to the invaders and the invaders' enemies alike, had preserved lives, delayed destruction, and disrupted the Reich's plans. Eric Mueller, the quiet factory worker, had altered the course of a small corner of history without leaving a single signature in its record. He returned to his modest apartment, exhausted, yet unburdened by the need for recognition. Letters from colleagues, some alive, some never returning, spoke in cryptic gratitude. "We could not have survived," one wrote. "Your calculations, your care, your courage, it saved us." Yet the world outside, reconstructing itself amidst the rubble, would never know his name. No history book would call him hero. No monument would bear his likeness. The war had devoured the visible stories, leaving only fragments like whispers in the wind. In the years that followed, Bromberg was rebuilt, its scar slowly covered by new streets, new buildings, new generations,
who would grow up unaware of the sacrifices made behind closed doors. Erich Müller returned to work in factories, not for recognition, but for the quiet dignity of labor. He never spoke of the war. He never sought accolades. The knowledge of what he had done was enough, a secret ledger of lives preserved, of destruction diverted, written in invisible ink only he could read. Yet the impact of his acts persisted. The soldiers who survived carried stories of improbable failures and delays that had saved them from certain death. Those stories, retold in hushed tones around mess halls, barracks, and camps, became a faint echo of Erich's invisible resistance. Each recounting preserved a fraction of the truth, even if the man behind it remained unknown. As the decades passed, the world moved on from its wars. Factories modernized, technology advanced, and memories faded into archives and museums. But for those who had lived through it, Bromberg's hidden history remained alive, a testament to the quiet power of a single person's courage. Erich Müller, who walked the line between survival and destruction, between obedience and defiance, became a symbol, not of glory, not of fame, but of the subtle, persistent human capacity to alter the course of events from within, without spectacle, without recognition. In the end, the city survived, lives were spared, and a Reich crumbled, undone in part by the work of a man who wielded no weapon except intellect, patience, and moral resolve. History may have overlooked him, but the people who lived and survived remembered. And in that memory, Erich Müller's legacy breathed, quiet and invisible, yet enduring like the soft hum of a factory machine long after its work is done.